Hi-Rez Studios has a certain reputation within select circles. Best known for SMITE and Paladins, their continued support for these games has accrued many dedicated fans. However, there are some among the ranks who refuse to support them. That's because, once upon a time, Hi-Rez weren't known for keeping games alive, they were known for killing them. These days, a considerable majority aren't aware of what came before SMITE. So let's have a look at what made Hi-Rez Studios so notorious.
Enter the recon.
You kidding me? Whatever.
Global agenda. No elves.
Global Agenda was very 2010. It was a hybrid between a sci-fi MMO and a class-based shooter. The game featured Team Fortress 2-esque PvP and PvE against waves of enemies. Conquest, easily the most interesting mode, mixed hex grid-based strategy and PvP. Global Agenda as a whole placed emphasis on agencies, the game's equivalent of guilds. Agencies were of especial use within Conquest, as agency leaders could command members like an army. Say that one agency launched an attack on another. Numerous fights would break out across the playing field, all of which would affect the overall outcome. Throw in some base building, unique rewards, and a system for alliances between agencies and you can begin to see the appeal. Global Agenda would use an MMO subscription model, with a $30 upfront purchase and $13 monthly payments to access Conquest and higher experience levels. However, at launch, Hi-Rez claimed, "We want to earn your subscription, and we will wait to charge for subscriptions until we feel we have done so." As such, everything at launch was subscription free. The game released on February 1st, 2010 to a tepid reception. Players appreciated the mix of shooter and MMO elements, but found each half to be underwhelming. Gunplay lacked the punch and polish of dedicated shooters, and class balance was off, with robotics being particularly overpowered. The MMO aspect of the game also suffered. Conquest was split into 10v10 instanced battles, likely to reduce server demand, but this meant that the only massively multiplayer aspect of the game was the hub world. Critics were less forgiving in general. They found the story underwhelming for an MMO and the gameplay lacking in ambition beyond mixing two genres. In hindsight, Global Agenda's greatest weakness at launch was spreading itself out too thin. It released with 2 PvE modes, 5 PvP modes, and Conquest, all on top of the agency system and a small hub world with an arena mode. Covering too much ground left the game lesser than the sum of its parts. This was not the start that Hi-Rez had anticipated. A moderate reception in the games industry could be fatal, especially for an MMO. Without enough players, the game would die. So it's a good thing that a small community formed around the agencies and the appeal of Conquest. This was enough for the game to survive. Next, Hi-Rez would try and turn it into a success. Over the following months, Global Agenda received small updates to improve the overall experience, such as social features and changes to Conquest. Conquest also saw its first full win in a season. Each season would last 2 weeks, and the rewards were usually distributed at the end. In this case, the Alliance managed to end the season prematurely by conquering the entire map. After a lot of positioning, hard work, and great team play, we made good on our goal to become the world first winners in Global Agenda. Not so long ago, it was just our agency fighting to secure our own base and holding off the CTC Alliance onslaught to get our shields up. If anything demonstrates the unique appeal of Conquest, it's stories like these. However, the mode in general presented a problem for the game at large. It greatly accelerated power creep. Players were approaching the game's level cap, and with each Conquest season, more and more of the game's best items were being distributed. Soon enough, the well of content began to dry up, and doubts were cast upon the game's longevity. In the meantime, Hi-Rez were wrestling with their own issues. To address the underwhelming player count, a free trial was added, which gave access to early level non-subscriber features. Speaking of subscriptions, they still hadn't been implemented. Hi-Rez had a big expansion in a pipeline called Sandstorm, and they extended the now called Subscription Holiday until its release. That way, the game would be more comprehensive by the time that they finally started charging players. The Sandstorm expansion released in 2 parts. Phase 1 arrived in June, adding new weapons, armor, mods to replace the upgrade system, PvE and conquest changes, new PvP maps, and DirectX 10 support. As you can see, it was a big update. To address power creep, the level cap was increased, and the new, highest quality items would only become available at higher levels. Wait, wouldn't that just make the power creep worse, I hear you ask? Yes it would. This update was initially welcomed, but the general consensus soon turned sour. A major portion of the new mods and PvE content were to be restricted behind the upcoming subscriptions. This meant that a power divide would spring up between paying and non-paying players, which was, naturally, not received well. Include the fact that Conquest would also be sub-only, and suddenly people weren't eager to give up their subscription holiday. This caused such a stir in the community that between Phase 1 and 2, subscriptions were removed entirely from the game. Amusingly, at no point in the game's life were subscriptions actually available for sale. At the time, Todd Harris, executive director for the game, stated, "Hi-Rez Studios is committed to delivering the best value in PC gaming. In addition to including all of the game's initial launch content for free inside the single purchase price, we are bundling nearly 6 months worth of post-release content and features and including that within the single purchase game." The company planned to release paid-for expansions in the future as an alternative to subscriptions. The following month, Phase 2 of Sandstorm released. With it came the Sonoran Desert, a massive open-world PvE zone filled with enemies, new weapons, and various story-related missions. It actually sounds quite similar to the Plains of Eidolon in Warframe, which wouldn't appear until 7 years later. This update also introduced a raid mode, which was similar to high-level PvE. Sandstorm marked the largest update to Global Agenda since its launch, and I can't help but wonder how much of it was originally intended for subscribers only. Regardless, it's a sign that Hi-Rez's plans were changing just as much as their game was. The real question is whether the transition away from subscriptions would really pay out. Further down the line, a beta server was introduced to test new content and fix bugs. Meanwhile, shooter MMO competitor All Points Bulletin announced its closure, and the wily marketing team for Global Agenda took the opportunity presented to them. Emails were distributed which read, "Between today and Friday, September 24th, 2010, we are offering refugees from APB and other shooter MMOs an opportunity to join Global Agenda's growing community, along with a discount for the game." This is some seriously sneaky marketing, which demonstrates Hi-Rez's confidence in Global Agenda. To round off the year, Global Agenda had a Halloween event with a rethemed map and a 12 Drops of Christmas event, where challenges rewarded special holiday cosmetics. Despite the game's underwhelming launch, the Sandstorm expansion and the removal of subscriptions put it in better standing. The real test was whether their first paid expansion would make a splash with the player base. Plot twist, that wouldn't happen. Global Agenda went free to play with the free agent update in April 2011, 14 months after launch. A market was emerging for free-to-play PC games, later popularized by Team Fortress 2, and Hi-Rez must have considered Global Agenda the perfect candidate. The game's future expansions would be free, and players would be divided into free users and elite agents. A one-time $20 payment made you an elite agent, which gave you better loot, double XP and currency, access to the auction house and mail systems, the ability to create agencies, and other additional benefits. Anyone who previously owned the game would automatically be granted elite agent status. Boosters were also available for sale, which granted temporary currency and XP boosts, but these were already available before this update. The coinciding update brought with it a ton of content. Namely, it introduced a skill tree rework, complete rebalancing for every single class, new raid missions, a plethora of PvP changes, 2 new maps, and changes to Conquest and PvE. Particularly amusing are the in-universe changelogs. For example, due to further budget cuts in the CPSD manufacturing division, Commonwealth support class bots are no longer immune to EMP stuns. In my opinion, going free to play was a good call. GA previously suffered by dividing its game modes between paying and non-paying users, so giving elite agents supplementary benefits instead was healthier for the community. These benefits were also significant enough to warrant a purchase without creating a major power divide. In removing the entrance fee, Hi-Rez were essentially opening the floodgates to a large potential audience. The free Sandstorm expansion also helped to show the game's improvements since its launch. It was also the second time that their monetization plans were compromised, representing an all-out move to finally make Global Agenda a success. Only time would tell if it worked. Come September, the Recursive Colony update released. This expansion added a new area to the Sonoran Desert Zone with missions et al. 2 new maps were added, and elite agent status and boosters could now be bought with in-game currency, likely to reduce the skill gap. Finally, it featured a new raid, where players defended Dome City, the game's hub, from a direct attack. The irony is quite painful, as this would be the game's final update. Yeah, really. There was no formal announcement, the game just kinda stopped being updated. Forever. It's no secret that GA underperformed, but complete abandonment without a peep from the developers was certainly curious. The game's servers are actually still online, but somewhere along the line the game was delisted from Steam. This was apparently because Hi-Rez didn't want new players to be disappointed by a game on life support. Only 18 months after launch, the game was on its deathbed, despite being hot on the heels of its free-to-play potential. So, what went wrong? Well, to start, the game's launch was a clear factor. Mixing 2 massive genres left it spread out too thin. Hell, at launch the game had 5 PvP modes, 2 PvE modes and Conquest. The mediocre reception of the game may have doomed it from day one. After the matter, Hi-Rez CEO Todd Harris confessed, "We continued to create content and new features, but no matter how much work we did, the user base kept declining." This initial hiccup was worsened by the monetization compromises. Remember that both subscriptions and paid expansions were canned before they even launched. With no secondary income for over a year, it's no surprise that the game still suffered after going free to play. Despite the game's shortcomings, it developed a strong community that still hold out hope for a sequel. For a while, Hi-Rez encouraged the idea, but instead focused on 2 other projects that were announced earlier that same year. Both of these would use aspects of Global Agenda's design and code, and perhaps most importantly, they would take the lessons learned too. Fundamentally, I think with Global Agenda we learned that we went a little too broad and it was probably better to be more polished and deep even if the scope was more narrow. In hindsight, it was super ambitious, and we love it, but it was super ambitious. But we did learn that free-to-play with a more narrow offering would probably do well, so that was our main lesson. And that they did. The first of their new projects was Tribes Ascend, a revival of the online shooter franchise known for its skiing mechanic. The series, which began in '98, hadn't seen action since 2004, and Hi-Rez hoped that brand recognition would work to their advantage. The beta for Tribes Ascend began shortly after development on Global Agenda ended, and it was immediately clear how the company's priorities had shifted. Tribes was narrower in focus but far more refined. The class-based shooter had but 5 game modes, all variations on standard shooter modes. For reference, Global Agenda had 5 modes for its PvP alone. Tribes was also free to play from the word go. Team Fortress 2 had proven that not all free games were pay to win, and Hi-Rez were eager to follow in its footsteps. Tribes used a dual currency system. XP could be earned and gold could be bought. Most items were available through both currencies. 3 of the game's 12 classes would be free and the others could be earned or purchased. Cosmetic skins and XP boosters were some of the few gold-only items. New weapons could be earned or bought, but the prices were controversial. We'll get back to that. During its 2011 closed beta, Hi-Rez received a ton of feedback from Tribes veterans. Efforts were made to raise the skill ceiling, such as removing the speed cap on movement. In the beta, the game was poorly balanced, so Hi-Rez reduced the class count to 9, and every class was given more weapon options to allow for greater customization. This decision was met with praise from fans.
To a certain extent, there still are 9 classes and they are still have their own identity, but it's pretty crazy that in a beta phase they took the community's suggestions and what they wanted to heart and actually completely overhauled core mechanics of the game and how the whole class system actually works, and by far it is better than what they had in place before.
Weekly updates persisted through most of the beta until the game's official release in April 2012. To demonstrate the benefits of a narrower focus, observe that Tribes Ascend at launch had 21 different maps. That's a huge amount by today's standards. Tribes Ascend released to a great reception. Critics considered it a worthy sequel, and a breath of fresh air in an industry of slower, grounded modern military shooters. Tribes fans were grateful for a new entry in the series, though some lamented changes to the original gameplay. In general though, the game was faithful enough to the originals. The free-to-play format also brought in a fair number of players, as did its reception. Things were finally paying off for Hi-Rez Studios. However, not all was perfect. The game's balance was slightly off, and the grind was ridiculous. Using very loose calculations, I estimate that players would earn about 1000 XP for 25 minutes of play. Classes costed between 7 and 18,000 XP, meaning a grind of 2 to 7 hours per class. However, this wasn't the worst of it. Some weapons costed as much as 100,000 XP, which could take up to 40 hours to earn. For one weapon. Though these are rough estimates, it at least gives an idea of the insane grind for some of the game's items. To the surprise of nobody, this was met with significant backlash. Though beyond this fault, the free-to-play model had done well not to divide the player base too much, as any gameplay affecting items could be earned. Eventually. Tribes Ascend was executed far better than Global Agenda, and you can see it in Tribes' performance. Within a month, the game had over 800,000 registered accounts on PC. Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3 versions were planned but eventually cancelled. Todd Harris explained this, stating, "We wanted to do the free-to-play model and there wasn't a clear path to that on consoles early on. Based on that, we optimised the game around the strengths of the PC and specifically a keyboard and mouse control." Despite this, the PC launch was a significant success, and it showed that Hi-Rez had learned their lessons from Global Agenda. Things were looking up for Tribes. Through 2012, Tribes saw updates every few weeks because, as Hi-Rez put it, it is a constant balance between delivering more content, additional small features and additional polish. New weapons are our top priority. The main updates were 10 small expansions which introduced new maps, weapons and skins. Maps were free, weapons could be bought with XP or gold, and skins were gold only. These expansions also brought new features and changes, like custom servers or weapon upgrades no longer requiring XP, or tweaks to the movement. For example, with the help of community feedback, we have reworked some of the mechanics of the emergent gameplay of rock bouncing. The mechanic is more lenient than the last major patch. Bouncing off a rock at an extreme angle is possible again, but the player will lose some of their speed. The grace angle for a bounce that loses no speed has been widened. We will continue to adjust this feature as needed. Hi-Rez stuck to their word, as there was an expansion nearly every month. Then, in the final months of the year, the expansions abruptly stopped. You might assume Hi-Rez were pulling another Global Agenda, which was certainly what the fans were thinking. In the background of all this, distaste for Hi-Rez Studios had been growing. Generally, people greatly enjoyed Tribes Ascend, but the most dedicated fans were less approving of Hi-Rez's decisions. This reached critical mass when highly optimised routes made capture the flag rounds incredibly brief, to the point where Hi-Rez implemented a speed cap whilst holding the flag. That didn't go down well. The high cost of weapons was also a major sticking point, as were the appearance of server issues. None of this, however, compared to the single, unavoidable controversy underlying all of it. There was a distinct bitterness at something wicked their way came. Yeah, it was SMITE. What a shocker. The MOBA scene was birthed by League of Legends and Dota 2, and Hi-Rez wanted a piece of the pie. SMITE was announced just 1 month after Tribes Ascend was. The closed beta for SMITE began 1 month after Tribes release. SMITE followed Tribes everywhere it went, but SMITE's beta performed well, really well. Before even entering open beta, it had accumulated 900,000 players. The Tribes community had noticed SMITE, and knowing Hi-Rez's history with Global Agenda, they began to consider SMITE as a threat. Threat or no, Tribes was still holding its own, and in February 2013, the Game of the Year update released. This major update added 10 new maps and a new weapon. Buying the Game of the Year edition would unlock all classes, weapons and perks immediately, excluding only cosmetics and boosters. This update was Hi-Rez's way of bringing back lapsed fans, who left due to the game's immense grind. The thing is, were that the game's only controversy, it may have made a greater impact. Tribes' dedicated following no longer trusted Hi-Rez, for a number of reasons. One of these was modding. Before the game's launch, Hi-Rez were non-committal surrounding mod support, which is ironic considering the series' roots. One employee even admitted as much, stating,
"Modding is responsible for keeping the original Tribes games alive."
However, Hi-Rez's policy was to continually support the game, which, in their eyes, meant it didn't need mods.
Hi-Rez is definitely not a move-on type of developer. We're all about games as a service, so if looking at Global Agenda, you might like the game, you might not like the game, but one thing that we're consistently recognized for is the fact that we have updated that game constantly.
Of course, these statements were made before development on GA ended. Before the launch of Tribes, they said, "We are looking at this not as a fire and forget onto the next project type of game. With the complexity of today's engines, delivering mod tools and keeping them up to date is a very big endeavour. I try not to inject my opinion into these videos, but I am seriously not a fan of this policy. There is no way a company can reasonably expect to support a game forever, and once that support stops, the game dies. That's why modding and private servers are so important." However, Tribes supported neither.
Mod support. Are we going to be able to mod, or do we at least have the ability to maybe mod in the future, if not at the start?
Yeah, that is I know, a huge question. I see if no mod support equals fail, and no map editor equals fail. And so, I guess I'll give a long answer. One, just, we definitely, there's a lot of mod fans at the studio. Fundamentally, I think, mods allow a game to progress even after the developer moves on to other things. And so, but all that said, Hi-Rez is definitely not a move-on type of developer.
Despite this, some modding efforts were made by the community. One Tribes player who goes by the name Altimor managed to obtain a developer build that Hi-Rez had mistakenly left accessible. By changing some parameters in the game, he created a software development kit which contained unreleased maps and free use of weapons without the need for grinding. From this build, he created a software development kit which contained unreleased maps and free use of the weapons without the need for grinding. I highly recommend that you check out the interview that I conducted with Altimor, where he discusses the game's modding potential and Hi-Rez's reaction to the SDK. I'll provide a link in the description and at the end of the video. Meanwhile, the game continued to suffer from server problems, and months later, Hi-Rez still hadn't directly addressed the issue. This was a big deal because the game didn't have proper private servers. Instead, you could rent a server from Hi-Rez. This meant that if Hi-Rez stopped hosting servers, Tribes would die. That is, ignoring the potential for private servers via the SDK. This, compounded with the slower rate of updates, put fans on edge. Then, in July, Hi-Rez announced that the game wouldn't receive any updates for at least 6 months, so they could focus on SMITE. Months of frustration and worry reached a critical mass. Anger swept through the Tribes community in a fashion only made possible by the anonymity of the internet. Many people felt like Tribes was being abandoned, all for a game in an already saturated market. Some Hi-Rez employees lost their patience and began to lash back at the fans. On the Tribes subreddit, a post detailing the game's continued server issues was gaining momentum. One user made a mockery of SMITE and its $40 God Pack, to which someone at Hi-Rez finally responded with, "The God Pack is actually $29.99. Yeah, that was a mistake. As downvotes began to pour in, another employee replied, "Pfft, only -4, get on my level." This was the final straw for many, who swore to never support the company again for how they treated their community. The game's player count dropped massively in the following month, though just how much this was to do with the controversy is unknown. One thing was clear, Tribes Ascend was as good as done. So if this was such a big deal, then why isn't it discussed more? Well, it turns out that SMITE was a massive success. So much so in fact that the majority of their audience hardly knew about Tribes Ascend. I'm not exaggerating. When the aforementioned controversial employees eventually left the company, their departures were met with kind words and appreciation from the SMITE community. Times had moved on, and Global Agenda and Tribes Ascend were being left behind. By the time that SMITE officially released in 2014, it had accrued 3 million players. Hi-Rez had found an opportunity in the MOBA space and took it, and it paid off big time. They had finally developed a successful product, because in reality, neither Global Agenda nor Tribes were particularly profitable. Over their development, Hi-Rez lost $30 million, 3/4 of their combined budgets. Tribes in particular ended up being break-even at best, according to Todd Harris. We acquired the franchise probably more out of passion than having a specific commercial return in mind. Further comments from the company paint a clearer picture. Tribes received exceptional reviews, we kept adding new features and content, but just like Global Agenda, the user base kept declining no matter what we did. Tribes as a project was profitable, but for the most part we invested the profits back into Tribes, so it wasn't something that would really allow us to develop future titles with the profits and grow our studio and grow a second Tribes title. GA and Tribes have become little more than learning experiences for an inexperienced company. In that time, Hi-Rez discovered the benefits of a free-to-play model with a narrower focus, attached to popular genres and properties. Elements from Global Agenda's development can be found within SMITE, and even in Paladins, their most recent major release. Though GA servers are still up, the game is on life support, and it's only a matter of time until it disappears forever. Tribes Ascend risks the same fate. Hi-Rez never fixed its server problems, never allowed private servers, and though they later promised map-making tools, they never delivered on that front either. Its servers are still running, and community efforts allowed for modding via TA mods, but it's just one executive decision away from obscurity. So you can see why Hi-Rez has the reputation it does, but is it deserved? Somewhat. Evidently, Hi-Rez were passionate but inexperienced, and this lack of experience led to Global Agenda's monetization woes and lack of focus, and the PR disaster that was Tribes Ascend. I do believe that they wanted to fully support both, but couldn't make the necessary revenue, leading them to place their bets on SMITE. We had to make a hard decision around not enhancing Tribes Ascend and going all in on SMITE, which was difficult. I wish we didn't have to make that hard choice, but in retrospect I think it was a good one. If SMITE hadn't worked out, we definitely would have had to downscale. They also made the incredibly short-sighted decision to not support any community tools, essentially signing their own death warrants. Though GA and Tribes are still online, they're husks of their former selves. But wait! In 2015, Tribes Ascend got a new update. The Out of the Blue update added 3 maps, new weapons, tons of balance changes, vehicle changes, and a class system overhaul. Considering this was 2.5 years after development ended, it was certainly unexpected. At the time, Hi-Rez attributed this to the success of their current projects, allowing them to revive the older games. However, I'm not so sure that was their intention. Consider that when Hi-Rez ditched Tribes for SMITE, they promised the community that their next game would be Global Agenda 2. As we know, that would never happen. Then, in the midst of Paladin's marketing push, A Tribes Ascend update suddenly appears. Not long after, Hi-Rez officially stopped updating Tribes. It's almost like these two games are used as PR tools to increase hype for their current projects. The Out of the Blue update may have been a pleasant surprise, but it hardly put a dent in their old reputation. Ultimately, Hi-Rez were passionate for their work, but made some foolish decisions along the way, and had no other option but to abandon their first games. Though, to their credit, they have learned from this. SMITE and Paladins are examples of popular, profitable games from the company, and as such, they still receive updates to this day. There will always be those who boycott the company, but I think ignoring them would be a mistake. After all, SMITE and Paladins, despite their successes, do not have any community tools or modding capabilities. One thing that has not changed over the years is Hi-Rez's desire for games as a service. But what about when that service ends?
We're looking at this not as a fire and forget, we're on to the next project sort of endeavor.
And that's really how we think about games. We don't think about games as fire, forget, put it on the shelf, be done with it.
Our chief priority is making sure we deliver a fun game and one that we can continual support versus delivering mod tools.
Hi-Rez is definitely not a move-on type of developer.